Good afternoon and welcome to this third session of the Future of the Corporation Summits. In the second session that we had a little bit earlier on today, we touched on the 8 principles that the program on the Future of the Corporation has set out for implementing corporate purpose and focused in on one of them, namely corporate governance. And we addressed this issue from the perspective of different stakeholders to the firm: workers, society, shareholders and boards, and the environment. Some of the points that emerged were, firstly, the need to strengthen worker rights and the duties of directors to uphold the interests of all stakeholders, including their shareholders. That purpose drives superior performance all round, including financial performance, but there's often a need for executives and boards to make hard trade-offs and to recognize that there are not only win-win outcomes. Thirdly, the role that two-tier boards can play, as against the unitary board that we've got in the UK, in terms of mediating between different stakeholders and overseeing the implementation of corporate purpose by the executive. And finally, the need to recognize that purpose is core. It's not about corporate social responsibility, and it therefore should be delivered through an appropriate business model. The emphasis of the program on the future of the corporation is deliberately focused on the future and highlights the importance of technology. And that's the subject of today's session. Will technology solve the problems we face in relation to, for example, the environment, or will it create problems in the form of the future of work and further concentrations of wealth and control? What can be done to ensure it delivers solutions, not create problems? And what can business in particular do to ensure that? We have 3 speakers to address that. The first is Satya Nadella, who has been CEO of Microsoft since 2014, having joined the company in 1992. He's widely acknowledged to be a global thought leader and inspiration on the subject of purposeful business, and in 2019 was named the Financial Times Person of the Year. I spoke to Satya Nadella last week, and this is what he had to say. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'd like to start by asking you something around the theme of corporate purpose, which is at the heart of this summit, and ask you what you understand by the concept of corporate purpose and whether it aligns with the notion we've been talking about in the British Academy programme and in my book, Prosperity, namely to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people or planet.
First of all, Colin, it's fantastic to have a chance to join you, and really thank you for the opportunity. I've been, interestingly enough, coming at this where, I've been talking about 2 things constantly at Microsoft, about mission and culture. I feel like those are the 2 core pillars that give us the ability to sustain what we do as a business. And even when I think about the mission and the sense of purpose that is embedded in our company, I sort of talk about how it's about empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And the way I've also articulated in short form is, hey, if the world is doing well because of our contribution, we will do well. That seems to be the heuristic, I would say. It's like, okay, Microsoft's mission in using technologies to create that broad empowerment so that the world does well and people in the world do well, and therefore we then do well. And you've given it, I think, a great intellectual base. So when I read your book, in fact, in 2019, is when I said, wow, that's the best description I've ever seen of what the social purpose of a company and a corporation is. And so that's why I took that and said, okay, that's what gives me even the intellectual basis to talk about our mission. Because there's no God-given right that a company should just last. It should not outlive its social purpose. And so in some sense, being grounded in that social purpose construct, which needs to, and technologies will come and go, but that core social contract you have is what needs to be sustained. So I absolutely find it to be a massively clarifying definition.
And how then do you think that it helps in terms of driving success in technology-based firms? And in particular, how do you think it assists Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, see, first thing is the way I think about why having a social purpose is helpful is take, say, even what we are talking about. All of modern capitalism, all of the progress we've seen is what, 250 years old. It's all because we were able to figure out how to create these companies and capital formation and human activity in them that led to the modern life, where all of us can say we're all collectively as a planet living better than the way we were living in, say, 200, 300 years ago. There are unintended consequences. I'll come to it. So I think of it as a tech company, as a software company. We have one of those most malleable of resources. And the question is, can we drive more economic growth broadly? Even I subscribe to a little bit of Robert Gordon's critique of modern productivity in the United States, for example. In fact, I'm glad to see that he says the last time he saw real productivity growth was in the late 90s and the early 2000s because of the PC in the workplace. So, even if you argue about the calculations or what have you, but overall, I think we need more economic growth. The world is not growing as fast as it was. So I believe software and digital technology can absolutely help with that. So that's sort of the first priority we have, which is how can we contribute to it? But to your point, though, that economic growth has to have a few characteristics, right? In 2020, we can't go and say economic growth and for its own sake. It has to be inclusive, first thing. That means it has to impact all the countries in the world. We can't have this north-south divide. It has to help small businesses and large businesses. It has to help all sectors. It can't be few companies in the West Coast of the United States or the East Coast of China. It has to be about all sectors of the economy, whether it's healthcare, agriculture, or what have you. So inclusive growth broadly, I think is a super important thing. Second is trust in technology, right? You can't have, basically to your point about break trust, whether it's around cybersecurity, privacy, AI, ethics, or even internet safety. So you can't have products that fundamentally break trust in institutions. Sustainability, that's another area where you can't, again, have economic growth and then break the planet. So all of us have to come together because we shared one limited resource called the planet. And lastly, I would say we also have to deal with, access, right? I mean, if you think about the systemic issues, today in the United States, we're having a very active dialogue, thank God, about what the issues of systemic racism have been, right? Whether it's access to technology, education, jobs, as well as proper criminal justice. So I would say we have to sort of, as a company, not only deal with economic growth, but how can we as a company even help with all of these issues around inclusive growth, sustainability, trust in technology, and even the places where, the markets have essentially failed. So that's why I sort of think about technology can be helpful, but one needs a holistic architecture.
Now, some people would say that sounds absolutely fantastic, but isn't it just too much for any company to be expected to try and tackle those problems alongside being a profitable business? Shouldn't it just focus on its core activity of making money and let governments and whoever deal with all of those other issues you were talking about?
I mean, it's the right question to ask, right? So you can't have this all be done out of the goodness of the heart, just because it sounds good. It has to be built into, I would say, the incentive system of how companies actually prosper. in the long term. And the key is the long term, right? Because if I you say, everything I talked about economic growth, if it came and yet we broke the planet, we created more, inequality in sectors and in societies, I think we will lose as companies license to operate. As a CEO of a multinational company, one of the things that I'm grounded in is what is the license to operate that I have? Only if I can look, if I'm in the United Kingdom, I have to look the people in the eye and say, here is how Microsoft's participation in the United Kingdom led to small businesses there becoming more productive, or large multinationals employing more people because of their global competitiveness, public sector efficiency, health outcomes, educational outcomes. So I think that you go back in some sense to your core business, your long-term interests, and then work backwards. Then it gets simplified. Otherwise, you'll feel like, that's why I'm a big believer that this is not about ESG on the side. It has to be at the core of your business model.
Okay, and what does it take from your position and perspective in terms of leadership to actually do that, to essentially convert those technological solutions into profitable outcomes for companies? And what do you think that, as a leader of a major tech company, are the obstacles to really bringing that about?
I think the first thing is even articulation of the core purpose of your company and its business model, not just high-sounding words, but even articulating for both your own stakeholders, starting with the shareholders, right? So for me, going to my shareholders and talking about Microsoft's core sense of purpose and mission as all dependent on empowering people and organizations all over the planet to achieve more is not about, a particular technology product. In fact, I sort of even go back to our own history. When I joined the company in 1992, we used to talk about putting a PC in every home and every desk as our mission. Even by the late 90s, we had more or less achieved that, at least in the developed world. And since then, we were saying, look, what's our mission? What's our sense of purpose? And then that's why I went all the way back to the 1975 and birth of our company, where Bill and Paul's first product was, let's build the basic interpreter for the Altair. And I think that sort of is what Microsoft is about. We create technology so that others can create more technology, right? Especially software. In 2020, that is a more relevant sense of purpose, right? Where every business is digital. And we want to be able to do that. So to me, that's being able to articulate that more broader, not just a business goal, but the broader sense of what gives you both business model relevance and customer relevance, I think is super helpful. And to your point, though, take what we have done with accessibility. We used to always think about accessibility as something that you did because there was regulation or as a bolt-on after you built the product. But we were able to reconceptualize. There's 1 billion people in the world who have the need for accessibility technology. It's a big market. So if you combine, say, breakthroughs in AI and universal design, so breakthroughs in AI and design and technology, and said, let's go after, in fact, building better products, not only for this market, but by the way, if you build it for 1 billion people, and one thing, as somebody described it, all of us will need help at some point for some task. And so that's one example, Colin, of being able to sort of really create in the core of your technology advance and in the business model articulation, how you can, in fact, profit by creating social value outside.
That seems to me to be a really insightful observation, that one shouldn't regard those social obligations as an imposition on the company imposed by a competition authority. You should grab the opportunity in terms of interoperability and things like that as an opportunity for the company. Could I just pick up on one element of that, and that is in terms of this notion of purpose as also being about avoiding profiting from harm. And if you think about the development of computing technology, one element of that that's potentially harmful is obviously energy usage and CO2 emissions, etc. Now, you've set out a very ambitious and precise and impressive program for dealing with that issue at Microsoft. Can you just talk us through this notion as to how one can try and avoid the need for regulation or competition policy by essentially thinking about avoiding harm through technology?
No, it's a great point. So one of the things that I feel that happens especially in digital technology, it happens in all industries, but I think in digital technology, you have these digital network effects, and you scale very rapidly. And sometimes when you're scaling rapidly, but to your point, causing harm, that is, irreversible, then that's a pretty bad place to be in. And so one of the things that I feel technology industry as a whole and Microsoft as a participant have to increase our sophistication and maturity in how we deal with the unintended consequences of our scale. Whether it's cybersecurity, that's a great example. That's one place where I feel that, okay, how do we really come together as a tech community to ensure that cyber crime is on the decline? Because guess what? If there isn't, we all get impacted, right? What happens is the entire industry stalls. Same thing around privacy. If there are real issues on privacy, the industry stalls. Same thing with AI ethics, right? Even one of the things that's topical today is everything around facial recognition. So some amount of self-governance, but more importantly, regulation is needed so that there isn't a race to the bottom around ethics of even use of AI. But your point on sustainability, it's the same extension, Colin. To me, it came out. We are now, as one of the major cloud providers, major users of power, and energy. And so one of the things we said is before we talk about what the world should do, what should Microsoft do? So therefore, that's where we made our commitments around first, how do we get to carbon negative? How do we even go back to the very formation of Microsoft and recapture the carbon? We did the math. We feel that between our own scope 1, 2, and 3, here is how we can structurally change how we consume energy, from where do we consume it, what incentives do we need to create out there in the marketplace for clean energy so that we can be a good customer of all of that. So I think that we think of it as if we don't do that, we will. Our own customers will probably not want to use our products or our services. So there is a real demand out there for clean, products that are created using clean sources of energy. And so therefore that shift is what you want to be ahead of, not behind. So that's how I think we sort of were able to sort of come and say, we're not doing this as something on the side, but let's build it into the core of Microsoft.
Now, some people argue that even with the most inspired leadership promoting these ideas, it's incredibly hard for many companies to do this because financial markets, institutional investors aren't aligned with its fulfillment and can deflect companies from their purpose. Do you think that is a significant issue in this area? Do you think we need to have changes in governance arrangements of companies or the role of boards to overcome it? Or is it not as bad as all that?
I mean, it's a great question. In fact, of course, as a CEO who's accountable each quarter, ultimately, it's at least in the United States today, I am sort of evaluated every quarter based on the results that are mostly about sort of these financial results. So I'm grounded in it. So the way I've thought of, and it's a constraint of the system. I'm in fact keen to know and understand which countries, what forms of governance, what forms of market structures are able to sort of, in some sense, propagate a better model, perhaps, or even a diversity of models that serve us all well. So I'm a student, and hopefully people like you write more about those and we can learn from them. But as somebody who's a participant in the United States today, I have to just accept this as a constraint and yet take on the responsibility to articulate to our own shareholders. I'll give you one example, Colin. Take something that we did perhaps a year or so ago around low-income and middle-income housing. In fact, in and around where we are headquartered in Washington. The reason why we did that, and we were able to even go to our own investors and say, look, our employees live here. We live in a community. We don't live in isolation. We need teachers, we need firemen, we need all of the and by the way, inside of Microsoft, it's just not all software engineers. We have people who work in our cafeteria, who drive shuttles, who are all amongst us. They can't have commute burdens that just make them sort of not want to come to work and work amongst us. So they have to live amongst us. So we said, look, we were not going to have a company if we don't account for what are some of the systemic issues in the communities we live in. So that's what led us to put aside some capital for creation of these small, low-cost housing. And we articulated that to our shareholders. And our shareholders obviously believe in the long term of Microsoft. So that's sort of an example of how we as a management team need to do a great job of articulating why this is in the interest of our shareholders. And if we do a good job, they'll hold us accountable. And if we feel like, hey, this is what's improving our ability to attract and keep the best people in this company doing the best work, then I think, we'll make progress.
And do you think that this current pandemic crisis is a nice thing to have, but terribly sorry, we've got no alternative but to go back to our knitting and make money?
It's actually interesting that you say that, because to me, if anything, this pandemic should perhaps inform us all that, just think about it. Like in the United States, we literally traded 20% of our GDP for the lack of even basic civic tech that could have helped us all collectively be more ready for this pandemic. So if anything, I would say maybe it's time for all of us to revisit not only the social purpose of the companies, but what is the overall alignment between what should public institutions, private institutions do in order to prepare for these type of black swan events, so that each time it happens, we don't have this type of economic challenge. So I go to the exact opposite place, which is, I think, hopefully coming out of this crisis, we all redouble our efforts to that core, what is it that we need to do in order to make this world a better place? Because guess what? If the world is not a better place, all of us suffer.
Well, one thing we have learned from this crisis is that the notion that business doesn't need government, if one ever held that view, seems to have gone out of the window. Business very much needs government now. Do you think that there's more that governments can do to promote this notion of purposeful business and businesses that can really help to address a broader range of social and environmental issues?
Yeah, I first of all, I'm a big believer that it's that, you need public institutions, you need private institutions, and you need even broad societal sort of pressure to keep both of these institutions accountable. That's, I think, what we've learned as the successful formula, or as a couple of economists wrote, is the narrow corridor of progress. And I like that definition, because I think that there needs to be checks and balances, and you need each other. Even if you think about the internet, right? It was created because of public funding. Without the NIH, I don't know where we would be in terms of progress. That doesn't mean you can't have amazing entrepreneurial energy in the private sector, but understanding that this is a system that needs both sides, I think, would be a very helpful thing. So that's at the core. To your point, there are clear things, right? Who protects us? Consumer safety. It's regulation set by government, legislated by our elected representatives. So I do believe that we need to use our democratic institutions very effectively in order to be able to help make economic progress have those attributes we talked about, right? Which is there's more inclusive growth, there's more sustainability built into the core, there's trust. Those are, I think, super important, and governments have a huge role to play on many aspects of it.
Satya, we've talked a great deal about corporate purpose and Microsoft's purpose, but what about your own purpose, your personal purpose? What would you like to leave as your lasting legacy? That's
a great question, Colin. In fact, I was writing a piece that I'll post this weekend on my father, who passed away this last year. He was a civil servant in India. And, it's something that he would always talk to me was about building of institutional strength. I mean, he used to always sort of say, look, it's about people, but people contribute to building institutions that outlast them, that gives them deep satisfaction. That's what helps us as societies grow. And I've been reflecting a lot about that, institutional strength. And so when I think about that, to your point, if, say, when I'm gone from Microsoft is thriving and I contributed to that institutional strength, that to me would be success. So to me, whether it's, and I come back to culture. A lot of times when I inherited from both Bill and Steve so much of what they had instilled in this company. That institutional strength is what I was able to build on. And so that sort of is how I look at it. If the place is actually, somebody said the best way to define your success would be if the place even becomes even better after you've left, you may have done something useful.
Satya, I think that not only may you leave a lasting legacy for Microsoft, but I think your leadership might inspire many a business around the world to leave a lasting change for business as a whole. Satya Nadella, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colin. Such a pleasure.
So that was me speaking to Satya Nadella last week. I'd now like to introduce the Right Honourable Greg Clark, MP for Tunbridge Wells, former Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK, and now Chair of the House of Commons Select Committee on Science and Technology. The Secretary of State, he oversaw the implementation of the government's current industrial strategy that made science and technology a centrepiece of government policy, and also reforms to UK corporate governance that place corporate purpose at the heart of it. Greg, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Colin, it's a great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to this series. And thank you for the work that you have done over the years and recently in this context with the British Academy. I think there is a sense that during this pandemic, it is an important moment, whether we are locked down at home or certainly all working in different ways. I think there is a sense of taking stock and noticing things about the way we've worked with an intention to do things differently afterwards. And so the months and years ahead, I think, are going to be formative. And so I think the timing of this project is particularly apposite, and I hope that my colleagues in government will pay particular attention to the findings that you make. I'm keen that we should have a discussion, but I thought I would just, perhaps building on what Satya said towards the end, under your questioning, reflecting on some of the aspects of the pandemic that is changing thought and practice. One of the things that I think most people seem to be concluding already about the pandemic is that it's not so much changing things in a way that are unrecognizable, so much as accelerating some of the trends that were already in place. And the subject that we were talking about today, technology, being a case in point. The fact that we're meeting in this forum and that so many of us are spending so much of our working day, including partially the House of Commons meeting virtually. We're partly back physically. And all of the ways in which we are relying on technology perhaps more intensively, and the pace has accelerated recently, I think is characteristic of a number of different moves that have happened as a result of the pandemic. But just reflecting on a couple of aspects of this. One at the beginning and one at the end. Something that I, in my work as a constituency MP, and also from the purview of chairing the Science and Technology Committee of Parliament, have been taking an interest in. And what has struck me is that, perhaps paradoxically, given the importance of tech and the fact that clearly electrons don't transmit infection in the way that people-to-people contacts do. But notwithstanding this, I think a couple of recent observations I would make have underlined the importance of human interaction to make possible tech interaction. And the first is this: right at the beginning of the pandemic, in which people suddenly had to isolate themselves, including some very vulnerable people who were advised not to go out at all. There was a great uptake, of course, in home shopping, and particular people looking to supermarkets to have home deliveries. And this is done online, and delivery slots were in hot demand. I, in common, and talking to many other constituency members of Parliament, had a deluge of calls and emails and letters from people who were, for one reason or another, hadn't been online customers of supermarkets before, and in the early days were struggling to get delivery slots. But the fact of these delivery slots was of huge importance to them, especially in the unknown early days when people really didn't know how they were going to be fed and to feed themselves. And what happened was that a very well optimized online system of booking had to be supplemented by a very human override. And members of Parliament across the country were in telephone or email contact with the head offices of the supermarkets, putting people on the list for priority deliveries because of human conversations that we'd had that had identified their vulnerability and their priority. And what I think had been building up as a system that was, as I say, very well optimized technically, in which everything could be done online, had to be adapted to allow a human interaction, human interface there, in order to be able to get food to people who were vulnerable and isolated. And in addition to the obvious moral requirement to make sure that people were being served, it was very evident from all of the supermarket head offices that there was a real reputational imperative there to show that they were open to humans in society, not only those that were historically the most IT literate and tech equipped to have had those slots. And coming back to some of the more recent decisions, everyone watching from the UK will be aware of the travails of the contact tracing app that the government has been developing through the NHS to be able to detect the contacts that people have had, that if they subsequently find that they've been exposed to the coronavirus, need to be contacted and ordered to, or advised to, self-isolate. Everyone that's watched this will know that it has been a process not without its difficulties, not without its teething troubles. And it hasn't really worked in the way that was hoped and to some extent expected. And very interesting, the evidence that my committee has taken is that in many countries around the world, an app for contact tracing has not enjoyed the success and the confidence, and in some cases the trust that was hoped. So in in this country, it's run into technical difficulties, which I'll refer to in a second. But talking to officials in Singapore, for example, a very well qualified and tech advanced nation in many ways, the take-up of the app has been much lower than was hoped for, indeed expected. The app that has been deployed in Norway has been withdrawn because of privacy concerns. There are big questions that have arisen about the ownership of data, which go to this real question of trust. The Apple and Google have insisted on a decentralized approach, not wanting to gather information that then is transmitted to third parties, in this case, to the NHS. Now, there is great advantage in the National Health Service gathering data to be able, for entirely good and honourable purposes, to be able to track the spread of the pandemic, to know in great detail what its patterns are. In a decentralized system, that is lost. But the fact that the companies have been wary to the point of resisting sharing data, even for the purposes of a public health emergency, I think point to some of the wider concerns. There have been, through the testing and piloting process that's taken place here, there have been concerns that individuals have about their personal privacy, even though it is anonymized. The idea that actually people can work out who has reported, who has had the virus and perhaps has strayed recklessly too closely to them and has caused them the inconvenience of needing to have themselves isolated for 2 weeks. That can have punitive consequences for individuals, and that has been a problem. But the most striking thing that I've heard in recent days was some evidence that we took from a minister in the Department of Health in my committee last week, who said that the pilot that had taken place of the NHS app on the Isle of Wight had revealed that what people really insisted upon was a human interaction. They wanted to have a conversation with a human that persuaded them that enough was known about their case for a report to be thought to be valid. And if they were going to lock themselves away, great inconvenience for 2 weeks in order to protect others, they were disinclined to do so on the basis of a completely humanless interaction, an app detecting their proximity to others, resulting in a text message saying you must go home and isolate. They said they weren't going to do that. They wanted to have a conversation with a human if they were to do that. And so one of the perhaps paradoxical lessons I think that is emerging from tech during the pandemic is actually an appreciation of the role of human interaction. However isolated we are looking for human interaction, whether to recognize our individual circumstances and make sure that we're put on a list, or whether it's to be persuaded through a conversation rather than a, no doubt, technically efficient notification to change our behavior. And I think this has something in common with the recognition that I think is widely felt across the country, that notwithstanding the acceleration of some of these tech trends, such as online shopping and meeting, actually there is perhaps a renewed recognition and value that is being attached to those workers, those physical workers, whether they are in the NHS in the UK, whether they're in care homes and care settings, whether they are shop workers, dustbin men and women, people whose perhaps value hasn't been recognized enough, and from whom perhaps attention has not been strong enough as the possibilities of tech and automation and AI have rather perhaps in recent years distracted away from the importance of that human interaction. So that is one of the reflections that I make from my vantage point as chair of the Science and Technology Committee of the course of the pandemic so far.
Greg, thank you very much indeed for that very insightful and thoughtful set of ideas. And I absolutely believe that this notion of the human element alongside technology is the key issue that this raises, essentially bringing the humanities into the sciences and recognizing the importance of trust, and trust coming from humans. I'd now like to introduce third speaker, Professor Ngaire Woods, who is the founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University and Professor of Global Economic Governance at Oxford. She's on the board of several companies and an advisor to many organizations around the world. Ngaire.
There, I'm unmuted. Hello, Colin, and what a pleasure to take part in this discussion. I'd like to come right back to where Satya, Nadella, and you began your conversation, a corporation with purpose. And to give you the punchline of my remarks, I'd like to say that corporations that want to be driven by purpose are never going to be able to do that without an effective partnership with government. Let me take you back to a London which had 5-year-old children working in factories, the London of Charles Dickens. He knew, because as a small boy, he had to work in a factory. In that London, where children of 5 or 6 would die in factories, who was it that pushed for reform? I'll tell you who pushed for reform: 2 very wealthy factory owners, Sir Robert Peel, the senior, and Robert Owen. These wealthy factory owners did not want children dying in their factory floors. And they knew one thing. They knew that the way to deal with this was to go to government and to pass legislation. And they knew that because, just as Satya Nadella reminded us, that the modern corporation today is going to have to report to shareholders, is going to have to report quarterly as a CEO, that against that pressure, those very clear incentives, it's very difficult to be purposeful when you know that all your competitors will be much less purposeful and therefore outcompete you. Those factory owners in 1802 understood that and began a process in Britain of legislating the age of factory workers. Now, what happens when corporations don't turn to government? What happens when we don't get an effective partnership? Let me give you another example. In Bhopal in India in 1984, there was a terrible chemical accident. Some 500,000 people were poisoned by a gas that escaped from the Union Carbide factory. And in the wake of that crisis, the chemicals industry globally, some companies created something they called the Responsible Care Code. It's a great example of corporations with purpose trying to do self-regulation. In the year 2000, 2 very good academics evaluated the results of the Responsible Care Code. And what they discovered using SEC filings was a little bit depressing, because it was actually the dirtiest companies that joined up to this self-regulatory code, and that over the period they looked at, those companies actually did worse than the companies that did not join the code. So it was a very well-intentioned effort, but it didn't succeed. And it didn't succeed for reasons that other scholars have shown clearly. It's not enough to try to set a self-regulatory code and to promise each other that you'll report on it, because the risk of cheating still starts to shape behavior and still starts to shape shareholder expectations. What you need is something more. You need much clearer, more rigorous enforcement of the rules so that every corporation with purpose knows that they're not going to be undercut. It's a simple point, but it's an important one. The third point I want to make is about the other side of the equation. We think a lot about how to regulate corporations, the corporate governance rules that you've already discussed today. But let's think about the other side of the equation. What is it that we should expect from government? Because too often people think about the rules thinking that the rules need to be light touch and agile and nimble. Whereas actually the evidence shows us it's not the rules that need to be light touch and nimble. It's the regulators that need rules they can apply in a light touch and nimble way. So just my final example today is to think about marine oil pollution. This is a good example of regulation because in the 1970s, there were two types of regulation that were tried. One, which was to fine oil tankers that discharged their toxic waste at sea. So that was a very cheap solution for industry because they didn't have to do anything except change their behavior, and they would only be fined if they were caught. The alternative was to require them to actually rebuild their ships, to build into their ships equipment, SBTs or double hulls, which would not permit them to pollute the sea and would require the ship itself to carry the waste or to clean the waste and discharge it in a way that didn't affect the sea. So on the one hand, you had a solution which was very cheap for the companies, but very expensive to enforce because it turned out you can't fine ships for discharging toxic waste unless you have thousands and thousands of coast guards patrolling the sea and actually catching them in the act. The more expensive version, requiring tankers to have these double hulls, meant that the regulator just needed a clipboard, a 25-year-old with a clipboard going down to the port and saying, do you have the equipment on board or not? In other words, it's to think about regulatory design and to think that for the effective partnership of corporations with purpose and governments to work, we need to think about what it is that the corporations with purpose want to achieve, and then why that needs to be enforced and enforceable in a way that not only they and their boards, but also their shareholders understand on the one side. And on the government side, we need to think about how to intelligently design regulation so that it minimizes the capacity that governments need in order to enforce it. So I would come right back to what Satya Nadella said to us, that we need to understand that this is a system which needs two sides. It needs the corporations with purpose on one side, and it needs really effective, well-designed government interventions on the other. And I think only with that kind of effective partnership can you really achieve purposeful business.
Thank you very much indeed, Ngaire. So let's pick up. We've had lots of questions coming in. Let's just pick up on that last element in terms of a partnership being needed between government and the corporate sector in terms of giving real effect to the notion of purposeful businesses going forward. Greg, perhaps you could just respond to what Ngaire was saying in terms of, well, actually, at the end of the day, we're going to have stronger, better enforcement of regulation if one's really going to give teeth to this.
I think there is a recognition that's come out of the pandemic. We've taken this to the limit. We've all been ordered to stay at home, and in particular respects, I think the people will accept the need for direction. Again, one of the interesting questions when it comes to learning the lessons of this pandemic is, in the early days, it was assumed that the kinds of restrictions on people's liberty that were being imposed starting in Asia were a marvel to behold, but simply wouldn't be available to policymakers in the West and in the UK in particular. And it was also assumed that adherence to rules would be less than it turned out to be. And so I think the sense of solidarity that has been demonstrated suggests that if there is a true common purpose and the rules are recognized as necessary, I think there is support for that. But it can't be abused. And one of the discussions in recent weeks is how you remove some of those rules, and we have seen it fraying a little as people have felt that they are disproportionate in some circumstances to where we are, hence the Prime Minister's announcement today. So there is a balance that needs to be carefully judged there. But I think our experience has shown that people do recognise the collective benefit of responsibility.
And there's a question that's come in about whether you, Greg, think that the UK government will change corporate governance rules to take account of new notions of purposeful business, in particular in this technology context.
I think there has been for some time an interest in this, and one of the reasons that I've been a great student of your work, Colin, and the influence that it's had is that I think the recognition, this goes back for many years, and certainly our conversations until recently have been citing the global financial crisis quite a bit, the consequences there. I think the sense that people in many democracies, not just the UK, have been dissatisfied with the return to them, as it were, of the current corporate framework has been very noticeable. And we've seen particular examples such as the energy price cap, for example. That's obviously a rule that governs behaviour rather than corporate governance. But a Conservative government introduced a cap that eradicated the penalty that loyal customers were paying, and it passed in the House of Commons with virtually unanimous support in a way that a few years ago I don't think would have been the case. So I think there is an appetite to reflect and to act on these public concerns.
And Ngaire, perhaps I could turn to you in relation to what Greg was talking about in regard to the importance of the human element in technology, and ask you what is the way in which you think that could be best achieved? We've had a question in that talks about forms of governance or constraints that need to ensure that technology is a force for good. What sort of changes do you think would really help to give people greater confidence and trust in what is happening on the technology side?
That's a very, very broad question. I think there's all kinds of concerns that people have about technology, whether they're geopolitical and whether we should have suppliers from specific countries that have different regulatory arrangements. There's problems about whether we want private companies to hold our data and what they do with that data. And there's concerns which you raised with Satya Nadella about the fact that we all think that when we're using technology, we're doing things which are climate friendly, when in fact we're not, because the energy usage for the servers and machines that drive the technology are huge. So I'm not sure which of those that you want to start on, but I would come back to perhaps the issues that Greg Clark has been involved in, which is the relationship between government and business in seeing us through this COVID-19 crisis, where the government has quickly become the investor of last resort or the lender of last resort to business. And the CEOs that I speak to in Britain are crying out for government to set new rules on business, because it is so difficult for any of those individual companies to take the move on their own. They want a level playing field, and it's government that can do that. And it feels as though government is being a little bit timid in setting a clear set of rules. You know, should it be the case that only companies that actually pay corporate tax fully in Britain have access to furlough and loans from government? Should it be the case that there are minimum work standards, or that you know, minimum sustainability standards that companies have to play? Or even more importantly, when we think about the future of the British economy, should it not be that government assistance is aimed at ensuring that companies adapt and become stronger to compete after the crisis, rather than continuing to pay companies to simply sit zombie-like, you know, not working because they can't, quite rightly. So I guess I've got questions about what are the best levers to ensure that government responses to COVID-19 create a more effective, sustainable, cleaner, fairer business in Britain? What would the first thing you would do be, Greg Hans?
So perhaps there has been a question that's come in on exactly that topic, and perhaps we could end on this question of what sort of conditions should be placed on government financial support to ensure corporate progress made towards social goals. So perhaps if both of you in 30 seconds could just give the main policies that you would like to see promoted in this area. Ngaire, perhaps we could start with you.
Oh, well, I hinted at my answer just then, but to me, it would be, now that we know that we've got to grow out of this crisis, to me, the important conditions would be conditions which enable British workers to reskill, to train, to find new work. So it would be to link what we do to support workers with opening up new opportunities for them. And likewise, it would be to link assistance we give to companies and firms to ensuring that they are adapting so that they can do even better, you know, through and after the crisis.
And Greg, any quick thoughts on that? Are you unmuted?
I think he's muted.
Can you unmute? Yes.
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
I was agreeing with what Ngaire had to say, but I think the context is that in the early stages of the pandemic, the most important thing was to make sure that we didn't lose firms in all of a sudden. And so we reversed the normal process of policymaking. Normally, especially for big and radical and expensive policies, there'd be a lot of consultation and design that went before the policy was announced. In this case, it's been the other way around. The policy has been announced in broad brush terms, and then some adjustments have been made, or perhaps not made, afterwards. But once we, I think, recover our ability to be able to take long-term policies and convert some of these into long-term policies, it has to be, in my view, the policies need to support an industrial strategy which is geared towards equipping us for the future. What Ngaire said about skills is absolutely crucial. If we're going to have a shakeout in employment in some industries, then it's very important that we back the people who will lose their jobs to be able to have the skills to work elsewhere. I think that is incredibly important, and I'd like that to be one of the hallmarks of the response. I think there will be, going back to a point I made earlier, an acceleration in some of these trends, and there needs to be an acceleration in the policy response to support that.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you, to all our speakers, Satya Nadella, the Right Honourable Greg Clark, and Professor Ngaire Woods, for a wonderful set of presentations and discussions. And I'd like to thank everyone involved in producing this session, and to thank all of you for having watched and sent in questions in regard to it. We can look forward to two great last sessions of this summit tomorrow, and I very much hope that you will be able to join us for that. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.